We're good? I think we're good. All right. Sorry about the technical difficulties. Never fails. I'm about 3 for 3 or 4 for 4 now with not getting these things to go off the ground when they're supposed to. But I'm Billy Griffith here tonight for our Emerging Revolutionary War, Rev War Reveille, live with you with author and historian Jack Kelly to discuss his new book, Valcour, the 1776 campaign that saved the cause of liberty. So Jack Kelly is an award-winning author and historian who lives and works in New York's Hudson Valley. He has published 5 novels and is the author of nonfiction works about the Pullman Strike of 1894, the Erie Canal, and on the history of gunpowder as well. He's authored 2 books on the Revolutionary War, Band of Giants, the amateur soldiers who won America's independence, and his newest work, Valcour, which was released in April that we will be discussing tonight. So Jack, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Billy.
And before we get into the actual historical content, I want a little background on why you wrote this book. What got you interested in writing about the Battle of Valcour Island?
When I wrote Band of Giants about 5 years ago, I covered various aspects of the war, and I was particularly intrigued by why this important campaign on Lake Champlain in 1776, one of the most important years of the war, didn't get more coverage, and why there wasn't more interest in it. And I came to the conclusion, as I have been calling it, that this was the most important unknown battle of the Revolutionary War. And so it just seemed like a topic that, and there are not that many topics related to the Revolutionary War that haven't been covered to a certain extent. And this was as a big topic, and yet not a lot of books have been written about it. So I decided to go ahead and research it and get into it.
And I always thought it's interesting when it comes to battles that take place on water, because it's not really, it's tangible, but it's not tangible. You can't really walk out onto the water and stand where these vessels would have been fighting. And know there today near Valcour Island, there is a monument to the battle.
Yeah, so DAR put up a little monument and mentioned Benedict Arnold. And I think it's, to a certain extent, it's the participation and the major role that Benedict Arnold played in the battle that was at least partly responsible for it not being covered as much, that the people would rather sing the praises of George Washington than Benedict Arnold, even though George Washington was getting beaten pretty bad down in New York.
Yeah, at that time, he was definitely the biggest loser so far. Arnold was one of the biggest winners. So when writing this book, you mentioned how there's not too much out there already about it. What was the biggest obstacle when putting together the manuscript?
Well, I think partly it was the temptation to go into too much detail about the lead up to the battle, which was really the invasion of Canada. The same area, this Fort Ticonderoga and Lake Champlain, were used the year before by the Patriots to go up into Canada and take Montreal and then move on up to Quebec City. That's an interesting, and also I would have to say is somewhat neglected part of the Revolutionary War. I think it's a little embarrassing to think of the freedom-loving Patriots. Their first impulse was to go up and invade another province, as well as the fact that it was a complete disaster. So that the campaign in 1776 really came out of that Canadian invasion. So it's tempting to to get bogged down in that and not focus on just what happened in 1776. So I tried to cover it briefly, give it enough context so people can understand it without going into it too much.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things is, talking about that part of the Canadian campaign. Everybody thinks once we fight the Battle of Quebec on New Year's Eve, 1775, that's it. Then we're out of Canada. But no, the American Army is up there for the next 5 or 6 months.
Yeah.
So kind of leading off of that, set the stage. Like, what's gone wrong for the American Army in Canada now? Why are they going back to Ticonderoga?
Well, and not only were they up there, but the Congress sent quite a few thousand reinforcements up during the winter, and they would trudge all the way up there, a long supply line. And part of the fact was they just wore themselves out they were besieging the city of Quebec. It was a walled city. They made no progress. And then in the spring, the British sent over their expeditionary army, of which 10,000 of them landed in Quebec. As soon as the Redcoats appeared, the American army essentially collapsed and retreated very quickly down the St. Lawrence River, down the Richelieu River, and finally down Lake Champlain back to Ticonderoga, which is where they started out from. And the other big factor was that while they were in Canada, they contracted an epidemic of smallpox. And that swept through the army. It was very contagious disease. And when they finally got back to Ticonderoga and Crown Point, which is the other fort that they captured on Lake Champlain, of the 5,000 men who returned from Canada, about 3,000 of them had contracted smallpox and had to be quarantined. And so it was really a devastated army that ended up down there in Ticonderoga, given the task of stopping a British invasion that they knew was coming down the lake.
And mentioning how the Army's being ravaged by smallpox, I think that major smallpox hospital that a lot of the men near Crown Point and Ticonderoga will be evacuated to is at the southern end of Lake George. And within the past 2 years or so, there was actually remains of Pennsylvania soldiers who used to come to smallpox, I think in the winter or in 1776.
Yeah.
They found there.
And to call it a hospital would be a kind of give the wrong impression. It was they put up some shelters, some shacks. They slept on boards. They were lucky if they had a blanket, and virtually no medical care. And they're eventually gathered to be several thousand people in that essentially a camp, really. And very few, I think they had 2 or 3 doctors and some aides to care for them. And I give some of the details about the smallpox illness in the book, and it was a horrific experience to go through if you live through it. There was about 10% of people died, but just very painful, very debilitating. Fever, of course, the pox all over your body. So it was an ordeal for the soldiers that had it.
Yeah, because a lot of the bulk of the men who are going to be fighting the revolution, like many other American wars too, they're coming from rural areas, so they haven't been exposed to smallpox yet.
Exactly.
So
unlike the British Army, it was endemic enough in Britain that most people got some version of it during their childhood or teenage years, and most of the British soldiers were immune.
Yeah. So now talking about Lake Champlain and its significance, why are both armies fighting to try to control this body of water?
Well, the Americans had control in the beginning of the summer, or it was really July by the time they withdrew the army down to Ticonderoga. They had control, but just barely. They had several very small schooners and with cannon on them that they could prevent an army from sailing down. The British had plenty of transports to send their army down in what would have been large rowboats, really. But the transports would have been vulnerable if there was any Americans had ships with cannon on them. So both sides really began an arms race, and if whoever could build the fleet the fastest and dominate the other side would gain control. The British wanted to get control of the lake in order to attack Fort Ticonderoga. That would open up the prospect of going down to Albany and then on to down the Hudson River to really complement the attack that the Howe brothers were making at the other end of the corridor to take New York City. The Americans were desperate to prevent that from happening because Washington was having, of course, a very hard time in New York to begin with, and to have the threat of an attack from coming down into his rear from New York would have been, I mean, from down the Hudson River from the north, would have been devastating and probably would have ended the war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely, especially at that point. And obviously, John Burgoyne is going to be using the same exact invasion route.
Right. This, I mean, I can show a picture just to see how this works here. This is my book, and this is the corridor from Quebec City down the St. Lawrence, down the Richelieu River, down Lake Champlain, and there's Crown Point and Ticonderoga fairly close together, then down Lake George, all pretty much a water route. There was a brief portage over to Fort Edward where they could then get on the Hudson River and go all the way down to New York. So Albany, which is just down here, the Mohawk Valley. The other thing that the Patriots feared was that they would, if they got onto Lake Champlain, they could attack eastward into New Hampshire and then down and hit Boston as well from behind, or down go all the way down to Connecticut. So it was like the back door to New England. So it was really a critical, very strategic corridor, that whole path from Quebec City down to New York City. For the first 2 years of the war that was fought over back and forth.
And so now moving on, I saw your next slide that you had coming. Tell us a little bit about the high command for both sides of this theater, and try to focus too a little bit more on Philip Schuyler, who a lot of people know of but don't really know too much about, because he's someone whose role during the war is seemingly always overlooked. Played such a huge part when it came to the theater of operations in the North.
Yeah, the man on the far left of the screen here is Philip Schuyler. He was in overall command. He was one of the early major generals of the Continental Army. He was an Albany aristocrat. Interesting that he actually spoke Dutch at home, as almost everybody in Albany in those days spoke Dutch. Very wealthy, was considered to be kind of a lukewarm patriot, was not in favor of independence, and was quite sickly. So he mainly stayed in his mansion in Albany and commanded from there. The man on the spot at Fort Ticonderoga is in the center here is General Horatio Gates. Gates was a very experienced officer from having been in the, I think it was got up to being a major in the British Army, and was in the British Army for years, and had sold his commission to come over to America just before the Revolution. Quite a radical as far as politics went. But he was also had been, like Schuyler, he was not a battle general. They both had been in their previous military experience was in as kind of staff officers, that they were administrative people. And the third man who would actually be leading the fighting against the British was on the right here, General Benedict Arnold. He served under Gates. And he had virtually no experience, military experience before the war started. But I always say, each of them served a purpose. Schuyler was a genius of logistics, and had been in the previous war, had been a supply officer, and he knew, and it was very crucial to get the supplies that they needed up to Lake Champlain, which was pretty much wilderness at that time, and particularly nautical supplies to build the boats to stop the British. General Gates was a genius of administration, and they needed somebody that could restore morale, restore discipline, deal with the smallpox, organize the army that had come back there in great confusion, rebuild the fortifications around Ticonderoga, and Gates was the man to do that. And it turned out that Benedict Arnold, first of all, there was a bonus, the fact that he had been a sea captain before the war. So he was well up on sailing and nautical matters, let's say. And also, that's a little technical difficulty there. And so anyway, it turned out that Benedict Arnold was really a genius of war itself. He had a great initiative. He had a great sense of getting a jump on the enemy. Very aggressive, inspired leader of men, and was the perfect person to lead this nautical or this naval battle against the British on Lake Champlain.
And I think another thing about Arnold that a lot of people don't know about his pre-Revolutionary War life, but he also used to buy horses in Canada. So he was very familiar with that entire Lake George, Lake Champlain, briefly St. Lawrence River water route. And it was even, he knew about Fort Ticonderoga before the war even began, and pitched the idea to capture it to the Massachusetts Committee of Safety.
Right, which was a really crucial move. Then I think it was 3 weeks after Lexington and Concord, they took Fort Ticonderoga, which hadn't even heard the news yet that the war had started. And if they hadn't done that, it's hard to see how the Patriots could have won the war, because the British would have kept control of Lake Champlain. They wouldn't have had the guns that they moved from Ticonderoga down to take Boston back. So it was a crucial move, and it was a pretty good example of Arnold's initiative, and let's strike now and strike fast, and that was his attitude.
Now, people probably see the photo there of Gates and Arnold, and seeing that they're working together here. Everybody usually immediately thinks of their soured relationship during the Saratoga campaign. But they actually had a very, very good working relationship prior to that, early on in the war. And Gates at one point even writes that Arnold is indispensable.
Yeah. The first controversy that arose in the command was that Gates had been given charge of the army in Canada. He set off, he got to Albany, and he reported to Schuyler. Schuyler said, well, there is no more army in Canada, so you are now my subordinate. Gates didn't see it that way. He thought he was given the command of the army, period. And they had a very sharp disagreement about that. And Schuyler appealed to Congress to clarify it. The Congress backed Schuyler. So Gates then had to sort of put his tail between his legs, and he resented that. He was a very different type of person than Schuyler. He was much more radical than Schuyler. Gates was very popular in New England. Arnold was from New England, but he was friendly with Schuyler. He knew Schuyler from before. And so he had really a juggling act to keep both sides satisfied, and did it fairly well. Arnold was not himself very tactful person, but he managed to get along with Gates, and I think that Gates frankly admitted he knew nothing about naval matters whatsoever, so he needed somebody to guide the building of the ships and then the sailing of the ships.
Right. So eventually he is going to task Arnold with commanding the Lake Champlain fleet and also supervising the construction of these vessels. So what are some of the obstacles that the Americans are going to face when they're trying to construct this fleet?
Well, the main problem was, I'd say there was two main problems. One was that it was up in the wilderness. The Lake Champlain, Lake George area there were some traders went through there. There were a few farms, but it was largely wilderness. And the transportation to get up there was very limited. So to get supplies and to get lumber and to get particularly the iron and it's things like pulleys and sails and anchors and so forth was a problem to begin with. Then they needed people who were familiar with building ships, and the shipwrights. There were many shipwrights in America. They had a big shipbuilding industry, all on the coast. To build ships on a lake up in the middle of the wilderness, none of these guys wanted to go up there because they were making good money. Now the war was on. Everybody wanted, not so much the government, but there were a lot of privateers that were they wanted to get a ship built to get out and prey on British commerce. And the shipwrights had their hands full, and they had to offer large salaries and large bonuses to get them to come up there. And they finally did get enough to build the ships, but it was slow going. And it was the main part of the American fleet really took almost till October to get finished.
And on the other side of the lake, the British are going to then be constructing their own fleet. And Guy Carleton commanding those forces in Canada, rather than moving swiftly before the Americans can prepare their fleet, he chooses to spend weeks building up his own, including, which you mentioned a lot in your book, this frigate, the Inflexible.
Yeah. They had the rather less consequential problem for the British was that there were rapids on the Richelieu River, so they couldn't sail their large ships up from and they had a whole fleet that they brought over. They couldn't sail up from the St. Lawrence River into Lake Champlain, but from St. John's, which was their base, their shipyard, was above the rapids, and that they could sail from there right onto Lake Champlain. They had already, I think, 10 gunboats that had been constructed and then broken down and put on ships and brought over. So they just had to hammer them together. They had a couple of schooners that they largely had to take apart and drag up and put back together at St. John's. And then, as you mentioned, the frigate that they have, and I have a picture of that here. This is where the Americans were at Skenesborough constructing their fleet, and the British were up here at St. John's constructing their fleet. And this is Lake Champlain in the middle. This is one of the American boats. This is a replica that was constructed at the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum of the Philadelphia, which was an American gunboat. It's about 53 feet long, I think, total. And it's an idea of the size. These were not battleships by any means. And there's General Carleton, the British commander. This is a frigate, and this is kind of a generic replica that was been constructed of a frigate of that era, but it gives an idea of how much bigger and how much more powerful these ships were. And they constructed this 3-masted, square-rigged, really an ocean-going ship with a large broadside of 12-pounder cannon, and that's what General Carleton spent a month just putting that ship together. It had been under construction at Quebec City. They broke it down, brought it to St. John's, worked night and day, but it was a month lost. And instead of attacking in early September, it pushed the whole thing back to October. And anybody that's been up to Lake Champlain area or Adirondacks knows even in September it's starting to get cold. So it was moving on towards winter, and the delay, as it turned out, was unnecessary and really a big mistake on Carleton's part.
So you mentioned we have the frigate Inflexible there, and then the Philadelphia, which was known as a gondola.
Yeah, gondola. It was a gunboat or gondola or gondolo. They also called them. I don't know exactly why, but they were called a gondola because they were pointed on both ends. So they're not really like a gondola in Venice.
Okay. And what were some of the other types of vessels they're going to be using?
Well, the Americans wanted a what they call a row galley, which was about 74 feet long. It's about half again as long as the gunboats, and it had it could be rowed. Both of the gunboats and these row galleys could be rowed or sailed. It was a handier sailor than the gondolas. Had more guns, bigger, had a cabin and a quarterdeck in the back. So it was a slightly bigger, but still not a huge ship. The British, for their part, they had several schooners, which were fairly good-sized ships of war. They had a barge, an artillery barge that they constructed there, which was not a very good ship for sailing, but that they intended to use once they got down to Ticonderoga. It had heavy mortars and cannon, but could also be used along the way to blast ships on the water. And they had 22 gunboats, which were slightly smaller than the American gunboats. They only had one cannon on them. Americans had 3 cannon on theirs, but were the big advantage the British had that all the they had the Royal Navy personnel for sailing, for shooting the guns. Firing a cannon on water is a tricky business because you have to time the bobbing and the swaying of the ship, and when you're considering your aiming. So they had a considerable advantage, I would say, in almost every regard to what the Americans had.
Now, even before the American fleet is fully constructed, Arnold's going to take what boats he has and begin sailing north down Lake Champlain. And eventually, come October, he's going to end up in you refer to as a channel between the western shore of the lake and Valcour Island. What is Valcour Island, and why does Arnold choose to ultimately make his stand there?
Well, I can show that in a map. Here's a map of Valcour Island. I'll go back a little bit here. Here's the northern part of Lake Champlain, and Arnold and part of the fleet that he had finished, which did not include any of the row galleys. He had, I think, 6 gunboats. He sailed up and tried to get some intelligence of what was going on. The British were farther up the Richelieu River, which is here. And he maintained the fleet up in this area generally for about 6 weeks. As the season wore on, it became dubious whether the British were even going to attack. He decided to pull back to Valcour Island, which is down here, and closer to Crown Point, which was the American forward post. It was protected. There's a lot of storms that come down the Champlain Valley in the autumn, and he wanted an area where he could tuck the fleet in and be protected from the wind. It was also hidden from the British, if they were to come down the main channel, which would have been here. And so then he had his fleet generally in this area and was waiting for the British to come down the main channel.
All right. So it's the morning of October 11th, 1776. Carleton and the British fleet continued to sail up the lake towards Valcour. Did Carleton know Arnold was actually there?
I don't think he did. I think that somehow Arnold sort of intuited that Carleton would assume that he'd already retreated, that the American fleet, once they got any knowledge of how overmatched they were in terms of firepower and the size of the British armada, that he would have retreated. Would have been the logical thing to do. And I think he was intent on trying to catch up with him for whatever reason, and that's just speculation. Carleton did not send out. He did not take the time to explore and to have a cloud of canoes or row boats out ahead of him, scouting all the little inlets and islands, of which there are many you could see on that other map. That he just came down as fast as he could, hoping to catch up with the American fleet and destroy them. And so there's no line of sight into where the American fleet was stationed from the north. You would have to go way in and look around the corner sort of to see them. So he didn't do that. And basically the British came right down straight through here until they ended up down south of Valcour Island, at which point Arnold sent out several ships and fired at them from behind. And the battle and then those ships went back up here. He had a line of battle stretched across from the island to the mainland. And the British had to turn around down here with a wind coming from the north, which Arnold assumed that they would come down the lake from when the wind was behind them, and they had to sail against the wind to get up into this rather narrow channel. It's about a mile, not quite a mile off of the New York shore. That was proved to be impossible for the frigate. They have two schooners. One of the schooners did make it up into the battle. The gunboats, which were basically rowboats, could easily be rowed up. They then formed a line across facing the Americans and started a cannon duel, which was the main aspect of the battle that went on for about 7 hours all that day, shooting back and forth from a fairly close distance. Occasionally, some of the British ships who were down in here would try to shoot through and over the gunboats and shoot at the Americans, but they were out of range, and they just could not maneuver. Tacking back and forth, they didn't have enough room to maneuver up into the battle.
So as night begins to fall now, the cannons will begin to fall silent. And it's at that point that the Philadelphia, struck too many times that day, begins to sink. And this is one of the coolest things, because I'm sure a lot of people have seen this, but not really known too much about it, is the Philadelphia, was uncovered. And I think it was either the late 19th century, early 20th century, correct?
Yeah. It was salvaged in the 1930s.
Right. And now it's on display in the Smithsonian. So I think that's so awesome that there is something tangible, but something still remaining from this fight.
Yeah, I agree with you, Billy. In fact, I have some. I have an image here. I can get this going again. That's the replica of the Philadelphia, and this is the actual Philadelphia while it's being salvaged in the 1930s. And it gives you an idea. The boats were not that large. And this is as it is today in the Smithsonian on display. This is the actual boat. And it's, to me, is one of the most poignant relics of the Revolutionary War, because it's not a model, it's not a replica. This is the actual boat that the British in that water in 1776, the actual cannon. this cannon in the bow was still loaded when they brought it up, and the boards of the decks of that boat were absorbed the blood of people that fought for our independence. So it's I think it's a remarkable artifact of the Revolutionary War.
Yeah, no, it is incredible. So now it's dark. The British begin to go to sleep, thinking that they have Arnold trapped, and the next morning should wipe his fleet off the water. What happens next?
Well, the entire the Philadelphia was the worst of the damage to the American ships, but they were all shot up pretty bad, taking on water. A lot of men wounded, a lot of men killed, and they felt that it was a choice between surrendering or just staying there waiting to be obliterated, because particularly if the wind changed, the British large ships would have been able to sail down on top of them and would have easily settled the matter. Arnold got the idea of escaping, and there's still historians scratching their heads over how exactly did he do it, but he was able to. He knew the water a lot better than the British did. He'd spent a lot of time around there, taking soundings, seeing how deep it was. He was able to go in very close to the New York shore and essentially go through this blockade that the British had set up. The British, because they were unfamiliar with the terrain, kept off the shore. They didn't want to risk going aground. So there was a little gap, and the Americans were able to slip through it very quietly, muffled oars, and of course, one of the factors was on both sides, most of the men were temporarily deaf from all the cannon fire during the day. Got down outside the British cordon and rowed down against the wind until they got a good ways down the lake, and the British woke up. As soon as it got light, they expected to obliterate the Americans, and there was nobody there. And Carleton threw a fit and went into a rage, and somebody spotted a sail down the lake, and then they began a race that lasted 2 days, going south on Lake Champlain back towards Crown Point and Fort Ticonderoga.
And what happens? Does Arnold escape?
And then another battle broke out. The original battle was on October 11th, and the 2 days after that, a second battle broke out. The British were able to catch up because the larger ships were sailed faster, and they fought it out again for about 2.5 hours. Arnold and 4 gunboats. A few of the gunboats had sunk. A few escaped and got down to Ticonderoga. One of the galleys, one of the larger American row galleys, was captured by the British. But what Arnold had left with, he fought the British off for 2.5 hours, and then running out of ammunition, he ordered the whole group of ships into a little bay on the Vermont side, what's now the Vermont side of Lake Champlain, and they ran aground. They set all the boats on fire. When the fire got to what was left of the gunpowder, they exploded, and so there was nothing left for the British to capture. And they they then walked out. The men were saved. Arnold was very good about saving his men and not leaving them to be either captured or killed. And were able to get down to Crown Point, were crossed over, and then they gave up Crown Point, and they concentrated their defenses in Ticonderoga. And an interesting little factoid about that was that the bay where he grounded the ships was called Ferris Bay. It was a very small cove. It's about a half mile across. That name was later changed to Arnold Bay, and that's the only place in America now that's named in honor of Benedict Arnold. So
And as somebody in our chat here on Facebook had mentioned that, Arnold did eventually commit treason, he would have had cities, monuments everywhere, roads named after him, maybe even a
Yeah,
state. So that is interesting to know that there is something out there that still holds his name
yeah.
in honor of what he did. So Carleton continues on. He doesn't stop after he clears the lake of any Patriot resistance. He continues down towards Ticonderoga. What's going to happen when he gets there?
Well, the British got as far as Crown Point, which is about 10 or 12 miles north of Ticonderoga, and set up their base there. They brought the army down. The advance guard of the army was about 3,000 men, and were ready. The generals, who included General Burgoyne and General Phillips, they were ready to attack. They were eager to give it a try and attack Fort Ticonderoga. Carleton was more wary, and he eventually went down to Ticonderoga. They sailed down. They looked over the situation from a distance, and then they went back. And he then made the decision that he wasn't going to attack. He was afraid that if he began a siege of Ticonderoga but it's well into October now. It's got close to November. He knew how cold the winters were. He'd been governor of Canada for a number of years and was very familiar with the how Lake Champlain would freeze solid in the winter. He didn't want to get stuck. That would have been a disaster to be down there laying a fort under siege and have the lake freeze behind you, because that's your only source of supplies. So he thought he'd accomplished enough. He'd destroyed the American fleet for the most part. He had saved Canada. He was, he considered himself a hero, and this was a very successful mission. Why take the risk? Why not just go back, wait till spring, come down? They wouldn't have any worry about an American fleet then, and attack Ticonderoga on that basis in 1777, which is what happened. Only it wasn't Carleton that ended up in command.
Yeah, and at this point, Trenton and Princeton had not happened yet.
Right.
So it's very possible that Carleton would have needed to sail up Lake Champlain the next year, because the Patriot cause could have completely collapsed.
Yeah, that's possible too. Yeah, that's a good point, actually. Yeah, that's. I don't know how much information he had about what was going on in New York. It was a long route to get information, pretty much by sea, up from New York up to Quebec City or Montreal. But that's definitely true.
Yeah, and the whole time that the Americans have been building their fleet and the British in the North had been building theirs, Gates and his men at Ticonderoga had been improving or upgrading the defenses of the fort, which is in complete dilapidated condition at the beginning, since the French blew it up in 1759 during the war. So the American forces there are not only building new defenses, they're reusing the old French lines that were occupied by Montcalm's troops during the Battle of Carillon. So I would wonder, when Carleton and his men, they do arrive there, not only do they see the fort, but they see all of these outside works too. So it could have been a repeat, who knows, of the 1758 battle if Carleton decided to assault head on.
Yes, I think that's a good point, because that had to be in the back of their minds of how much blood they'd shed in order to win Ticonderoga. And Gates was very good at putting on a show, and they had a lot of flags, regimental flags flying. He would put the troops in the front lines, and with the bayonet sticking out. Even had some pikes that they were going to use to spear somebody coming over, and they built redoubts all along the peninsula on which the fort sits. And it was pretty formidable. And they had gun emplacements and another fort on the other side, what they called Mount Independence. They had those joined by the lake is very narrow there, so they had them joined by a boom and then a bridge. So it looked formidable. Whether they could have held out is hard to know. A lot of the troops at Ticonderoga were militia, and once the redcoats, if they had started to a serious charge or a serious siege, they may have been able to win, but it's something that'll never be known.
So Valcour Island is more so known as a strategic victory for the Americans rather than a tactical one, because clearly they lost the battle.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It was...
But they won time for Gates at Ticonderoga, and also time for the seasons to begin to change. What is the American response to the battle? And I know Arnold is praised, but he's also criticized for losing the Lake Champlain fleet.
Yeah, that was his second in command was David Waterbury, who was a respectable sea captain from Connecticut, and they got along all right until Waterbury's ship got captured. Waterbury then criticized Arnold for his incompetence in handling and allowing the fleet to be destroyed and his men to be captured. And there were several other people that raised criticisms, but the people in the know, including George Washington, the final verdict on it was that it was a brilliant move on the part of Arnold to use the fleet, because there's no point in having a fleet and just saying, well, we got a fleet, we're ready for you when you come down, but we're not going to fight. You had a fight, and he fought. I think the fact of the battle, the fact that they stood up and pretty much fought the Royal Navy to a draw, gave Carleton and the British second thoughts that how fanatical these people are, that they're willing to stand up to the Royal Navy. And in general, I think the conclusion was that it was a successful defeat. Let's put it that way. It was, as in so many of the Revolutionary War battles, Americans lost, but they bought time, they bought space for them to continue the war, and that's what happened with Valcour.
All right, so now to kind of begin to wrap things up, I think the best final question to ask, going off of your book title, is, well, why do you think this 1776 campaign along Lake Champlain really saved the cause of liberty?
Well, I think the importance of it, I really focus on two factors, two related factors, let's say. One is that I think, and I think most historians agree, that 1776 was the best chance that the British had to win the war outright. They had chances later on to win a negotiated settlement maybe, but if they could have prevailed in 1776, when they had a huge preponderance of force, when the Americans were at their weakest and most divided, that was their chance to really win the war. And the fact that this campaign was so instrumental in preventing them from winning, I think makes it just a very, very important aspect of the war. The other related reason is that after the British went back to Canada, Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold took 600 men that they no longer needed at Ticonderoga and marched down, partly sailed partly and marched a long way out around New Jersey into Pennsylvania and joined Washington on the other side of the Delaware River, where his camp was, in December. And getting towards the middle end of December, they got there. Washington was trying to make a decision. We can't really know what he was thinking or what factors he considered, but if you figure, he knew that the threat from the north was neutralized. He had these 600 extra men. For whatever reason, he decided to cross the Delaware. A very risky move, very famous attack on Trenton, and beat the Hessians and really turned the war around and certainly restored American morale. And some of the guys who fought at Valcour Island in October also crossed the Delaware and fought at Trenton in December. So I think that was another important way in which it influenced the outcome of the war.
And one of those men to not cross the Delaware, though, was Benedict Arnold, because he's ordered up to Rhode Island by Washington to command troops there.
But they had a little talk. They had a little talk, before Arnold left to go on that assignment in December. And it would be interesting to know what was said there. And certainly Arnold would have been the type of guy who would have said, if Washington was saying, I'm thinking of making a move, he would have said, make it, do it. So, and I think Washington got a lot of, he liked Arnold, and he got a lot of the energy that, from this younger guy that's aggressive, and Washington was in a low position. He wrote to his brother, I think in December, I think the game is pretty near up, and he was really figured that this may be the end. So to turn it around like that was quite a phenomenal thing.
Yeah. So Valcour Island definitely was one of the lone bright spots in that dark year. So thank you, Jack, for joining us tonight. And if anyone has any further questions for you, is there a way that you can be reached?
Yeah, I have a website. It's called jackkellybooks.com, and I have a contact page on there and some more information about the book. So I'm always glad to hear from people.
All right, great. So you can join us in 2 weeks on June 27th for an interview with our own Phil Greenwalt to discuss his upcoming release and the next installment in the ERW book series, The Winter That Won the War, The Winter Encampment at Valley Forge. So look out for that. So thanks again, Jack, and thank you to everyone who tuned in tonight. For the rest of your Sunday.
Yep.